My name is Camille Devereux. I'm 31 years old. And the morning my grandmother's estate attorney called me a thief in front of 40 people, I was wearing the same secondhand blazer I'd worn to every job interview for the past 3 years, because it was the only one I owned. I remember the exact texture of the conference room air, that particular coldness that only exists in rooms built for money, the kind of cold that comes from mahogany and recessed lighting and the collective body temperature of people who have never once had to choose between a car payment and a grocery run. I remember the way my cousin Preston adjusted his cufflinks when the lawyer said my name, the way my Aunt Vivienne set down her water glass so carefully, it didn't make a single sound. I remember thinking, they planned this. They actually sat somewhere and planned this. And then the lawyer said, Miss Devereux is the subject of a formal complaint filed with this office, alleging unauthorized access to Mrs. Eloise Devereux's private accounts. He paused. The amount in question is $412,000. The room went completely still, and I just sat there, in my second-hand blazer, staring at the grain of the conference table, waiting for the part where someone said this was a mistake. That part didn't come. Not yet. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. It costs you nothing, and it means the world to me. And I want you to drop something in the comments right now. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I'll be reading every single one, because the people who find these stories tend to find them for a reason, so let me know you're here. I'll wait. Now, let me take you back. Let me take you back to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the spring of 1999. I was 4 years old. My grandmother Eloise Devereux, gran to me, Mrs. Devereux to almost everyone else, lived in a house on Oleander Point that had 12 rooms, a wraparound porch, and a wisteria vine on the east wall that bloomed every April like it was trying to prove something. I know those details because I memorized them the way children memorize the things they love, but are never quite sure belong to them. My mother Diane was Eloise's youngest daughter, and in the Devereux family being the youngest daughter meant being the afterthought. Eloise had 3 children, my uncle Roland, who ran the family's commercial real estate holdings, and wore his entitlement, the way other men wear cologne, everywhere, always, without apology. My Aunt Vivienne, who married into the Thibodeau family and treated that marriage like a corporate acquisition, and my mother Diane, who fell in love with a musician named Marcus Webb, married him at 22, and was never fully forgiven for it. My father, Marcus, was a good man. I want to say that plainly. He was a session guitarist who made decent money in good years and lean money in bad ones, and he loved my mother in a way that was visible from across rooms. But he was not the right kind of person. According to the Devereux family ledger, he did not have the right last name, he did not have the right portfolio, and so my mother's place in the family had a ceiling on it that nobody ever acknowledged out loud but everyone understood completely. I have 2 specific memories from childhood that I need to tell you about, because without them, nothing that comes later makes sense. The first is from Christmas, 2001. I was 6. My cousin Preston, Roland's son, 3 years older than me, already carrying himself with the particular arrogance that only comes from being told your entire life that you are the future of something, received a bicycle that year. It was a red Trek mountain bike with chrome handlebars, and I can still see the shine of it in the living room of the Oleander Point house. I remember sitting on the floor next to my mother, watching Preston ride it in circles on the hardwood, and I asked Gran if I could have one too. And she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, Baby, Father Christmas knows what every child needs. I didn't get a bicycle that year. I got a used paperback copy of Charlotte's Web, with someone else's name written on the inside cover. I told myself it didn't hurt. The second memory is from when I was 9. My school, a public elementary school in Baton Rouge called Audubon Elementary, was doing a special spring program. A week-long science camp in the Atchafalaya Basin that cost $320 to attend. My parents didn't have $320 that month. My dad had just had a slow quarter, and my mother was working part-time at a dental office while taking night classes. I knew even at 9 that $320 was not a casual conversation, so I didn't ask my parents. I asked Gran. I wrote her a letter. I want you to understand that I wrote it by hand, on stationery I borrowed from my mother, in my best cursive, because I'd been told that Gran respected effort. I told her about the science camp. I told her what I hoped to learn. I told her I would pay her back from my allowance, which was $4 a week, which meant I was offering to be in debt to my 70-year-old grandmother for approximately 1.5 years. I thought that showed good faith. She never responded to the letter. Preston went to a private science program in New Orleans that same year, 2 weeks. It cost $3,000. I know that number because I found the receipt in a drawer once, years later when I was helping Gran with paperwork, and she had no idea what I'd seen. I told myself that didn't hurt either. Here's what I need you to understand about my grandmother. Because she was not a simple villain. Eloise Devereux was a complicated woman who had built something real. Her late husband, my grandfather Edouard, had started the real estate company in 1961, and by the time he died in 1987, the company had holdings across 3 states. When he died, my grandmother was 58 years old and had 4 employees who expected her to sell. She did not sell. She expanded. She was sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She had opinions about everything from interest rates to interior design, and she was usually right. I respected her. I genuinely did. But she had a hierarchy in her heart, and everyone in the family knew it, and the people at the top of that hierarchy were Roland and Vivienne and their children. And my mother and I existed somewhere further down, invited to holidays and tolerated at Sunday dinners, and occasionally looked at with something that might have been warmth, if you tilted your head and caught the light just right. My mother handled it with a grace I did not fully appreciate until I was much older. She never spoke badly of Gran in front of me. She never turned her bitterness into a lesson she expected me to absorb. She just kept showing up, kept being present, kept being Diane, warm and steady and good, in a way that the Devereux family seemed constitutionally unable to recognize. My father died when I was 17. A car accident on I-10 in November of 2009. He was coming home from a session in New Orleans. The other driver ran a red light. My father died on impact, and I found out at school, and I remember walking to my locker and opening it and staring at my chemistry textbook for what felt like a very long time. We could not afford a funeral that did justice to who he was. My mother's family offered no money. Gran sent a flower arrangement. I want you to feel that. Gran sent a flower arrangement. My mother went back to work full-time, and I graduated high school and got a partial scholarship to Louisiana State University and worked 2 part-time jobs to cover the rest. I studied accounting because it was practical and because some part of me understood, even then, that numbers were a language I needed to speak fluently in order to protect myself from the kinds of people who used them as weapons. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone was supposed to catch you and didn't, drop a torch in the comments. You know who you are, and I see you. I graduated from LSU in 2014, magna cum laude. My mother came to the ceremony. Gran did not. I told myself I was fine with that. Mostly I was. I moved to Atlanta after graduation and got a job at a mid-size accounting firm called Hartwell and Crane. I was good at it. Not immediately spectacular but consistently reliable in a way that compounds over time. By 2017 I was a senior associate. By 2019 I had my CPA and was making $68,000 a year and living in a 1-bedroom in Midtown, and for the first time in my adult life, I was not afraid of my bank account. And then, in September of 2019, my mother called me and told me that Gran had had a stroke. It was not catastrophic, as strokes go. Gran retained most of her function, her speech, her cognition, but it shook something loose in the family structure, and when things shake loose in families like mine, the pieces don't settle evenly. There was a meeting. Roland and Vivienne flew into Baton Rouge, and my mother and I drove down, and we all sat in the Oleander Point house and had a conversation about what Gran needed going forward. What Gran needed, it turned out, was someone to help manage her personal finances. The household accounts, the charitable giving, the quarterly reviews that her previous bookkeeper, a man named Gerald Fontenot, was no longer able to manage reliably due to his own declining health. Roland and Vivienne were too busy with the corporate side to take it on. My mother didn't have the background, but I did. Gran asked me herself. We were alone in the sunroom, the one with the fern wall and the view of the back garden, and she looked at me over her glasses the same way she had when I was 6 years old, asking for a bicycle, and she said, Camille, I know you're good with numbers. I'd like you to help me keep things in order. And I said yes. Because she was my grandmother, because she'd had a stroke, and because some part of me still believed, at 24, that proximity to her meant something, that being trusted by her meant something. I want to be precise about what my role actually was. I was not managing the Devereaux family holdings, the corporate entity that Roland oversaw. I was managing Gran's personal household accounts, monthly expenses, the property taxes on the Oleander Point house, the utilities, the groundskeeping contract with a man named Terence Mouton, the cleaning service, the quarterly charitable donations Gran made to the Baton Rouge Food Bank, her parish and the Louisiana Land Trust, and her personal medical expenses. I was also given signatory access to one account, a household operating account at First Southern Bank, account number ending in 7742, specifically for the purpose of processing these expenses. That access was documented. It was formal. It was approved in writing by Gran's attorney, a man named Philip Arsenault, in an engagement letter dated October 14, 2019. I need you to hold those facts, because they become very important later. I did this work for 3 years. I drove down from Atlanta to Baton Rouge every 6 to 8 weeks to meet with Gran in person. I managed every payment. I maintained a ledger that I shared monthly with Philip's office. I flagged potential overpayments on 2 vendor contracts. I caught an error in the property tax assessment on the Oleander Point house that saved Gran $11,000. I never charged Gran a fee. I did it because she was my grandmother. And in those 3 years, something shifted between us. Slowly, quietly. The way things shift when two people are actually spending time together rather than performing family at holidays. Gran started calling me on Tuesday evenings, just to talk. She started asking about my life in ways that were more than courtesy. She told me once, on a Tuesday call in February of 2021, that she was proud of me. I wrote it in my journal that night, because I had never heard her say that before, and I was 30 years old and I still needed to hear it. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what came next was not an abstract betrayal. It was the specific and deliberate destruction of something I had slowly, carefully built with someone I loved. Here is what I did not know was happening while I was managing Gran's household accounts. Preston had been struggling. Roland's son, the golden boy, the future of something. He had made a series of what I will charitably call aggressive financial decisions in his late 20s. He had invested heavily in a private hospitality venture that collapsed in 2020. He had taken out a personal loan that he had not disclosed to his father. And by early 2022 he was under significant financial pressure, and also, crucially, afraid of his father finding out the full extent of it. I didn't know any of this. Preston and I were not close. We spoke at family events with the particular politeness of people who share blood and nothing else. And Gran had recently redone her will. I found this out later, but I want to tell you now, so the architecture of what came next makes sense. In January of 2022, Gran had updated her estate documents. She had, for reasons she did not fully explain to the family, changed the distribution of her personal estate, not the corporate holdings. Those had their own succession plan, but her personal assets, which included the Oleander Point house, 3 investment accounts, and approximately $2.4 million in liquid assets. She had, in her updated will, named me as a co-beneficiary alongside Preston for a significant portion of those personal assets. Roland and Vivienne found out. I don't know exactly when, but they found out. And then, in March of 2022, Gran had a second stroke, more significant this time. Her cognition was affected. She was moved into a specialized memory care facility in Baton Rouge called Magnolia Gardens. And suddenly the woman who had asked me to manage her accounts, who had called me on Tuesday evenings, who had told me she was proud of me, she was no longer able to confirm any of that clearly or consistently. And that is when the Devereaux family decided to make their move. Drop a candle in the comments right now if you can feel where this is going, because I need to know you're with me. It started with a phone call from Philip Arsenault's office, not from Philip himself, from an associate I had never spoken with before named Brandon Lejeune. He left me a voicemail on a Tuesday morning in April of 2022, asking me to pause any transactions on the household account, pending a routine review. His tone was neutral enough that I didn't immediately panic. I called back. I left 3 messages over the course of a week. Brandon did not return my calls. I sent an email to Philip's direct address. No response. I called Roland. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me, and he said, "Camille, I think it's best we handle this through proper channels." I said, "Handle what?" "Nobody has told me what's happening," he said. "We'll be in touch." And he hung up. I want to pause here and tell you what that felt like. Because this is not a moment where I cried, or panicked, or fell apart. This is a moment where I became very, very still. I have learned, in the years since my father died, that the most dangerous thing you can do when someone comes for you is to react emotionally before you understand the full scope of what they're doing. My stillness is not compliance. My stillness is calculation. I did 3 things that week. First, I made copies of every document I had from my 3 years of work for Gran. Every receipt, every ledger entry, every bank statement, every email exchange with vendors, every communication with Philip's office. I organized them chronologically in 3 separate folders, one physical, one digital, one backed up to a cloud service that I paid for out of my own pocket. Second, I called a lawyer. Her name was Dana Fontaine, and she practiced estate and probate law out of a firm on St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans, and a friend from LSU who had gone to law school had told me once that if I ever had a legal problem in Louisiana, Dana was the person to call. Third, I went to Baton Rouge. I drove 5 hours down from Atlanta, and I went to Magnolia Gardens, and I sat with Gran for 2 hours. She knew me. She held my hand. She asked me if the wisteria had bloomed yet. I told her I thought it had. Then, 2 weeks later, I received a letter. Formal letterhead. Arsenault, Lejeune, and Thibodeau. I noted that last name, Thibodeau, which was the family my Aunt Vivienne had married into 30 years earlier. The letter informed me that my signatory access to the household account had been revoked, and that the Devereaux family was conducting a formal financial review of all personal account activity for the period of October 2019 through March 2022. I was asked to make myself available for an interview. It was still framed, at this point, as a review, not an accusation. Dana told me not to panic. She also told me not to say a word to anyone in the family until we had a clearer picture of what they were actually claiming. The clearer picture arrived on a Thursday morning in May of 2022, in the form of a formal complaint filed with Philip Arsenault's office. The complaint, filed by Roland Devereaux on behalf of the family, alleged that I had made unauthorized withdrawals from the household account, totaling $412,000 over the course of my 3-year tenure. It alleged that these withdrawals had been disguised as vendor payments and charitable contributions, and that I had falsified records to conceal them. $412,000. I sat in Dana's office in New Orleans, and I read that number, and then I read it again, and I said, "Dana, that number is larger than the total amount that passed through that account in 18 months. She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "That's exactly what we're going to show them. Because here is the thing. The thing that Roland and Vivienne and Preston had apparently not fully considered when they constructed this claim. I had 3 years of meticulous records. Every dollar I had ever moved through that account was documented with corresponding invoices, receipts, bank confirmations, and in many cases secondary vendor communications that could be verified independently. I had not just done this job well. I had done it with the specific and perhaps unconscious preparation of someone who has always known that she might one day need to prove herself to people who were looking for a reason to disbelieve her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before we got to the proving, we had to get through the hearing. Grand's capacity hearing had been scheduled for June 14, 2022. This was a formal legal proceeding convened to evaluate Grand's cognitive state and determine whether a guardian of the estate should be appointed. Roland had initiated it, ostensibly out of concern for Grand's welfare in light of her second stroke. Dana had explained to me that this type of hearing, while it would focus primarily on Grand's capacity, would also likely surface the financial allegations, because Roland had made clear that he intended to use the hearing to centralize control of all of Grand's affairs, personal and corporate, under his authority as eldest child. In other words, June 14th was the day they planned to make it official. Take everything. Lock me out. Use the financial allegations to discredit me completely, so that even if I fought back, the family narrative would already be set. I drove to Baton Rouge on June 13th and I checked into a Holiday Inn on Airline Highway because I was not going to stay in any house connected to the Devereaux family. I ordered room service and I laid out my documents on the bed, and I went over everything one more time with Dana, who had driven over from New Orleans and was sitting in the armchair with her reading glasses on, and a highlighter in her hand, which I found oddly comforting. At one point she looked up at me and said, "Camille, have you told anyone about the cameras?" And I said, "No, I was waiting." Let me explain the cameras. In 2020, 6 months into my role managing Grand's accounts, there had been a small incident. Someone, I never found out who, had gone through Grand's home office while I was in Atlanta. Nothing was taken, but papers had been disturbed, and a filing cabinet drawer had been left open. Gran had been agitated about it, and had asked me to look into installing a security system. I had arranged it myself, working with a Baton Rouge company called Pelican Home Security. The system included door and window sensors, a doorbell camera, and 2 interior cameras, one in the foyer, one in the home office where the household financial files were kept. The subscription was billed monthly to the household account, which meant it appeared in my records as a legitimate recurring expense. And it had been recording continuously in 30-day increments stored on a cloud server for 2 years. I had not reviewed the footage until the week after I received the formal complaint, and when I did review it, specifically the footage from the home office camera, I found something. I found footage of Preston Devereaux in the home office. 3 separate dates: January 8th, 2022, February 4th, 2022, and March 17th, 2022, which was the week before Grand's second stroke. In the footage, Preston was at the desk. On January 8th, he was on his phone for approximately 11 minutes, and at one point he opened the file drawer and appeared to be reviewing account statements. On February 4th, he had what appeared to be a laptop open and was entering information. On March 17th, this is the one that matters most, he was in the office for 43 minutes, and during that time he opened the file cabinet, removed a folder, photographed multiple pages with his phone, replaced the folder, and then sat at the desk and typed for a sustained period on his laptop. Gran was in the living room with her caregiver during all 3 of these visits. Preston had not asked me any questions about the accounts. He had not been given any authorization to access those files. He had just been in there. Dana had downloaded the footage the week prior and had it analyzed by a digital forensics consultant to confirm its authenticity and establish the exact timestamps. We had a certified copy. We had a chain of custody document. We had everything we needed. And on June 14th, 2022, at 9:45 in the morning, I walked into that conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Convention Street in Baton Rouge, and I sat down across from my family and their lawyers, and I waited. The room was exactly as I described at the beginning of this story. Cold, deliberate, Preston with his cufflinks, Vivienne with her water glass, Roland sitting at the head of one side of the table like the gravity of the room had organized itself around him. Philip Arsenault at one end with Brandon Lejeune beside him. A court-appointed evaluator for Grand's capacity proceedings, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Marchand, at the other end with a notepad. My mother Diane, was sitting 3 seats down from me. She had come because Dana had advised that her presence as Grand's daughter was relevant to the capacity question. My mother was wearing her church clothes. She looked the way she always looked in rooms like this, dignified and slightly out of place in the way that genuinely good people are often out of place in rooms that run on something other than goodness. I looked at her when I sat down and she gave me the smallest nod. That nod was everything. Brandon Lejeune opened the proceedings with a summary of the formal complaint. He was precise and flat, and he used phrases like unauthorized access and systematic misappropriation and fiduciary breach in a tone that implied these were established facts rather than allegations. He said the name Camille Devereaux 5 times in the first 4 minutes. I counted. Preston was watching me while Brandon spoke. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the table directly in front of me, and I kept my hand still in my lap and I breathed. Roland spoke next. He was more emotional than Brandon, not in a raw way, but in a performed way, the kind of emotion that has been rehearsed just enough to feel credible to people who want to believe it. He talked about Grand's vulnerability. He talked about his responsibility as the eldest child. He said, "We trusted Camille with access to our mother's accounts because we believed she had the family's best interests at heart. We now have reason to believe we were profoundly mistaken." His voice cracked very slightly on the word profoundly, and I thought he practiced that. I watched Vivienne when Roland spoke. She was looking at her hands. Not at me, not at my mother, not at Roland, at her hands. And I filed that away. Then the attorney invited me to respond to the complaint, and I said, "I'd like to do that, but first, I'd like to present some materials. Is that acceptable?" Brandon looked at Philip, who looked at Roland, who after a brief pause nodded. Dana passed a bound document across the table to each person in the room. 27 pages. 3 years of transactions, cross-referenced with invoices, receipts, and bank confirmations. Every dollar explained. Every number sourced. The total, documented and verifiable, was $208,000 across the full 3 years, every penny of which corresponded to a real expense, a real vendor, and a real receipt. Not $412,000, not 400,000, not even close. The room absorbed this in silence for about 90 seconds. Roland was the first to speak. He said, "This doesn't address the question of whether some of these so-called expenses were legitimate." And I said, "Page 17. You'll see that I've included contact information for each vendor, along with confirmation letters from Terrence Mouton's landscaping company, the cleaning service, and the charitable organizations. All of them have been contacted by my attorney within the past 2 weeks, and all of them have confirmed the payments and the services rendered." Roland looked at his own attorney. Something happened in that look, some small recalibration, and then Dana said, "There is one additional item we'd like to address." She nodded at me, and I opened my laptop. I had queued the footage in advance. The home office clip from March 17, 2022, 43 minutes compressed to 9. I hit play and I turned the screen toward the room. The silence in those 9 minutes was the kind of silence that has mass. It has pressure. It sits on your chest. On the screen, Preston's face was clearly visible. The timestamp was in the corner. The camera angle was such that you could see exactly what he was doing. The file cabinet, the folder, the phone held up to photograph pages, the laptop open, the typing. When the clip ended, I closed the laptop. Nobody spoke for what I am certain was a full 5 seconds. My mother made a small sound, very quiet. Not dramatic, just a small exhalation of recognition. Preston's face had done something complicated. It had started blank and moved through several stages. I don't have precise words for. I watched him understand that he was visible, that this moment, which he had presumably believed was private, unwitnessed, safely buried in the past, had been documented, and that every person in this room was now watching him understand that. Roland said, "That doesn't," and stopped. Vivienne was still looking at her hands. Brandon Lejeune was very still in his chair. Dana said quietly and without drama, The footage has been authenticated by a certified digital forensics analyst, and a copy has been filed with our office, along with the full chain of custody documentation. The dates correspond precisely to the period during which the transactions that form the basis of the complaint were apparently reviewed and, we believe, selectively misrepresented. We are also prepared, if necessary, to request a formal accounting of the account that Mr. Preston Devereaux accessed on those dates, compared against the figures cited in the complaint. That was the moment. That was the 5 seconds of silence. Preston's cufflinks caught the light. Dr. Sylvia Marchand, the court evaluator, was writing in her notebook. I looked at Roland. For the first time in that room, I held his gaze. He looked older to me than he had when I walked in. I don't mean that cruelly. I mean that something in him appeared, in that moment, to have lost some structural certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from never having been caught, from always having been the one who defines the story. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had just understood that the story had already been told, and he wasn't the one who had told it. I want to tell you something about that moment that I haven't told many people. I was not happy. I want to be clear about that. I did not feel triumph in that room. I felt a profound and complicated sadness, because what I was watching was my family do what my family had always done: choose hierarchy over truth, choose consolidation over fairness, and the camera hadn't changed that. It had just made it undeniable. And there is something deeply grief-laden about making the undeniable visible in a room full of people who would still prefer to look away. But I had not come to this room to grieve. I had come to be clear. Dana asked for a brief recess, and the attorneys agreed. We stepped into the corridor, and the fluorescent light out there was different from the mahogany cold of the conference room. It was the light of regular buildings, regular hallways, the kind of light I had lived under my whole life. My mother came out with us, and she took my hands in both of hers, and she looked at me and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your daddy would have thought you were something." I held that for a long time. We went back in after 20 minutes. Brandon Lejeune opened by saying that, given the newly presented materials, the firm would need to revisit the evidentiary basis of the complaint. This is lawyer language for the thing we built doesn't hold up. He did not withdraw the complaint in that session. That came later, formally, in a letter dated June 21, 2022. But it was over in that room and everyone knew it. Roland did not look at me for the remainder of the session. Preston did not speak at all. Vivienne, before we adjourned, asked for a brief word with me. In the corridor, alone, I looked at Dana, who gave me the smallest tilt of her head that I read as "your call." I said yes. Vivienne and I stood near a window at the end of the corridor. Below us, the street was ordinary. Cars, a delivery truck, someone walking a dog. Vivienne said, "I want you to know I didn't know about the camera." I said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know I wasn't comfortable with how this was handled." I looked at her for a moment. Vivienne Thibodeau née Devereaux, who had sat in that room for 2 hours while her nephew destroyed me, and had looked at her hands and said nothing, who had organized her discomfort very quietly and kept it entirely to herself until it was safe to acknowledge it. I said, "Vivienne, I believe you. And I also think there was a moment when your discomfort could have become something more than discomfort. I think you know that too." She didn't say anything. She nodded, very slightly. And I said, "I love my grandmother. I did 3 years of work for her because I love her. I would like to continue to be in her life while she's still here. I'm asking you, as someone who also loves her, to make sure that I have that access. That's the only thing I'm asking." Vivienne said, "I'll make sure of it." I don't know if it was the right thing to say. I don't know if it was enough, but it was true, and it was calm, and it was what I had. The formal complaint was withdrawn on June 21st. On July 3rd, Dana received confirmation that my access to Grand's account, which had been suspended, was formally reinstated, along with a written acknowledgement from Arsenault, Lejeune, and Thibodeau that the engagement letter from October 2019 remained valid. Preston did not reach out to me. Not then. Roland sent a letter. A physical letter, handwritten, which surprised me. It was 3 paragraphs. He said that he had acted on information he believed to be credible, and that he had not taken sufficient care to verify it before proceeding. He said he was sorry. He did not say what he was sorry for specifically, which I noted, but I read it as the most he was capable of giving, and I chose to accept it at that level. I did not respond to the letter immediately. I kept it on my kitchen counter in Atlanta for 11 days. Then I wrote back. 4 sentences. I acknowledged his letter. I said I appreciated it. I said I hoped we could find a way to maintain a relationship for Gran's sake. I said I was open to that conversation when he was ready. I sent it and I made myself not to expect anything in return. 3 weeks later, Roland called me on a Sunday afternoon. He sounded like a man who was not used to making calls like this. Unscripted calls, navigational calls, calls without a clear advantage structure. I let him be uncomfortable. I was warm. I answered his questions about Gran's account records. I walked him through the ledger. By the end of the call, we had agreed that I would continue my role managing Gran's personal accounts, and that going forward, there would be monthly communications to Roland's office as well. An additional layer of oversight I had not had before. I agreed to it immediately, because I had nothing to hide, and because accountability is not a burden if you're doing things right. Preston reached out in August. A text message at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, which is an odd time for a text, but I noted that it was not the middle of the night. It was not impulsive, not desperate, just considered enough to be sent at 11 in the morning. The message said, "Camille, I know there is probably nothing I can say. I am sorry for what I did. I was drowning, and I made a catastrophically bad choice, and I involved you in it, and you didn't deserve that. I don't expect a response." I sat with that text for 2 days. I am not a person who processes quickly in public. I need time. Then I called him. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. I said, "I got your text." He said, "Yeah?" I said, "I'm not going to pretend that what you did wasn't a serious thing. It was a serious thing. You tried to destroy my reputation. You tried to take something from me that I had earned. I need you to understand that I understand that fully." He said, I do understand that." I said, "I also think you're someone who was terrified and made a terrible decision and rationalized it in a way you probably can't fully look at yet. And I think you know that too." Silence on the line for a moment. He said, "Is there a path where we're okay? Eventually?" I said, "I don't know yet, but I'm not closing it." We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. We talked about Gran. We talked briefly about the family. We didn't resolve anything, but we talked. That September, I drove to Baton Rouge for what I'd been told might be one of Gran's clearer stretches. Her condition was fluctuating. There were good days and less good days. I went to Magnolia Gardens on a Saturday afternoon, and she was in the garden, in a wheelchair, in a patch of sun, and she was looking at a rose bush, and she was completely present. She knew me immediately. She said, "Camille, you look like you've been through something." I sat down beside her and I said, "I have been, Gran." She said, "Did you come out all right?" I said, "I think so." She patted my hand. Just once. And then she said, "Good. You're a Devereux. We come out all right." And I thought, I am a Devereux, but I am also a Webb. I am also Marcus's daughter, and Diane's daughter, and I am also the girl who wrote a letter in her best cursive, asking to learn about the Atchafalaya Basin, and the woman who kept records because she always knew she might need to prove herself. I am all of that. We sat in the garden for 2 hours. We didn't talk about the hearing. We didn't talk about Preston or Roland. We talked about the roses. We talked about my grandfather, Edward, who Gran said had been terrible at gardening but had tried very hard. We talked about my father, who Gran said she had not appreciated enough, and she said it plainly, without ceremony, in the way very old and very tired people sometimes say true things, directly because there is no longer enough time for indirection. "Your father was a good man," she said. I should have said so more. I didn't say yes you should have. I didn't say I know. I just sat with it and let it be true, and let her carry whatever portion of it she needed to carry. I'm going to tell you where I am now. It's 2026. Gran is still at Magnolia Gardens. Her condition has declined significantly in the past year, but she still has moments of clarity and I still visit when I can. I have accepted that I may lose her before we finish anything, before the account is fully settled between us, before whatever she meant to give me has all been given. I have made peace with that, mostly. Some days more than others. I left Hartwell and Crane in 2023 and started my own financial consulting practice in Atlanta. It's called Devereux Financial, which took me a long time to decide to use that name, but eventually I decided that the name is mine. Not theirs. Mine. My grandfather's name. My mother's name. My name. The practice specializes in estate and personal financial management for individuals and families, and I want you to understand the particular poetic specificity of that. I now do professionally, for other families, exactly what I was doing for Gran. Carefully, honestly, with documentation. The practice is doing well. In our second year, we exceeded $350,000 in revenue. We have 11 regular clients. We were listed in Atlanta Business Chronicle's 2025 Directory of Emerging Financial Services Firms. I am not telling you this to brag. I am telling you this because this is what comes after the conference room. This is what gets built in the aftermath of being looked at and found wanting. You build anyway. You build better. My mother visits Atlanta twice a year. We have a tradition of going to a restaurant called Bacchanalia on the night she arrives, which is expensive enough that it is still a treat and not routine, and I like that. I like that it still feels like something. We order the tasting menu and we talk for 4 hours. She is 61 years old and she is healthy, and she is still teaching part-time at the dental school, and she still loves her garden and she is still the best person I know. I have a partner. His name is Solomon, and he is a structural engineer originally from Accra, and he has the specific and irreplaceable quality of finding me interesting, not just lovable, of wanting to know what I think about things, not just how I'm doing. We've been together 2 years. He met my mother last spring, and the two of them spent an entire afternoon debating the structural logic of raised garden beds, and I sat in the corner and watched them and thought, this is it. This is the family I have chosen and built, and I am not going to qualify it or apologize for it, or explain why it took me this long to have it. I want to say something to you directly. Not as a narrative conclusion, but as one person talking to another. What happened to me in that conference room, the naming, the accusation, the moment when the people who were supposed to know you best look across a table and decide you're guilty of something you didn't do, that is a specific kind of violence. It doesn't leave marks you can point to. It doesn't make the kind of noise that draws witnesses. It happens in mahogany rooms with recessed lighting and water glasses placed carefully, and it is designed to make you doubt your own record of reality. The camera was important. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The documentation mattered. The meticulous record-keeping mattered. Dana Fontaine mattered enormously. But here is what I keep coming back to. The camera only caught what was already true. The records only confirmed what I already knew. The truth of what I had done. 3 years of honest, careful, unglamorous work for a grandmother who had not always been kind to me. That truth existed whether or not anyone ever believed it. And I think there is something worth holding on to in that. The truth of what you are and what you did does not require an audience to be real. You don't need a camera to be innocent. You need a camera when the people who should believe you have decided, for their own reasons, that disbelief is more convenient. This isn't a revenge story. I want to be clear about that. I did not set a trap. I did not build a case against my cousin out of malice. I installed security cameras because someone had been through a filing cabinet. The footage existed because good record-keeping habits don't take days off. What happened in that conference room was not revenge. It was architecture. It was the result of building carefully for a long time and trusting that the building would hold. If you have ever been in a room where someone is rewriting your story in front of you, if you have ever sat still while people who love you less than they should perform a version of you that you don't recognize, I want you to know that your records exist. Whatever you have built, however quietly, however unglamorously, it exists. And rooms like that one do not get the last word. They only get the last word if you leave before you're ready. I stayed. I showed the footage. And then I went home and ordered room service, and took off my second-hand blazer, and laid it across the back of the chair, and I called my mother and I said, "It's done." She said, "I know, baby." And that was enough. If this story moved you, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop your location and the time in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean it when I say this community is the reason I keep telling these stories. If you've been in a room where someone tried to define you, drop the word architecture in the comments. I want to know how many of us there are. And if you want to hear another story, one about what happens when the person you thought would always choose you finally has to choose, check the description below. It's there. It's waiting for you. I'll see you in the next one.